Hi, class. What we're going to be looking at now is going to be the brain. So we're going to look at the brain. We'll look at different parts of the brain and go through what some of their primary functions are. And we'll talk about some cranial nerves as well. So the brain's a pretty large organ. It weighs about 3 pounds, and it's involved in a lot of different important functions like sensations, its memory, emotions, your decision making, and even your behavior. And when you look at this is just a cross section of the brain cut in half. This would be, let me just change the color of my pen here. This will be anterior on this side, and back here is posterior. Whenever you see the cerebellum back here, that's always posterior. Okay. So we'll go through some of the names of some of the main parts. Like the largest part of the brain is the cerebrum. And the cerebrum has different lobes to it. If you think back to osteology, when you looked at the skull, we know that there was a frontal lobe, there was a parietal lobe, there was a temporal lobe, and occipital lobe, right? Those were I'm sorry, you had the frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, and occipital bone of the skull. In terms of the brain, we have a frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, a temporal lobe, and occipital lobe of the brain. Okay, so like up here, that's going to be your frontal lobe. And then over here, that's going to be your parietal lobe. And then back here, that's going to be your occipital lobe. And then the temporal lobe would be where the ear is, but because this is a cross section, I really can't point it out from this view. So that's the cerebrum, not to be confused with cerebellum. Cerebellum is back here. And then we have the brain stem, which is made up of the medulla, the pons, and then the midbrain, MPM, medulla, pons, midbrain. Below the medulla is the spinal cord. So when we look at the main lobes, this is the cerebellum. Remember, the cerebellum is always in the back. It's always posterior, so that's a good landmark. And the cerebellum is involved with balance and coordination and fine muscle control. This is why if there's a police officer and he pulls someone over for driving under the influence or DWI, driving while intoxicated, they may pull you over and have you walk heel to toe, because they're checking for your balance. They may have you touch your finger to your nose to see if you have the coordination and precision to do that, which also involves fine muscle control. So that's the cerebellum, really balance and coordination. It's involved in fine muscle control of a lot of things, like someone's speech, right? Smooth speech. The tongue is a muscle. So smooth, controlled speech. The heart is muscle. So the rate and rhythm of the heart is also regulated by the cerebellum. The cerebellum also deals with blood pressure to your extremities. So this is one of the things that I look at with my patients. If there's a blood pressure differential between the left upper extremity and the right upper extremity, is maybe there's a cerebellum imbalance or poor blood supply getting into the cerebellum. So there could be a 10-point difference between left arm and right arm when doing blood pressure. A lot of people don't discuss that, but it's pretty important. The occipital lobe of the cerebrum back here, that's for your eyes, that's for vision. So although your eyes are up here, your eyes only contain the receptors. It's going to send all the information to the occipital lobe of the brain that helps you see. So it's the brain that does the seeing, the eyes only have the receptors. Okay. Your parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is helping you know the difference between your right from your left and the perception and sensation between the right and the left. People that have parietal lobe issues, these are people that say, look at my left ankle, it's so much more swollen than my right ankle. oh my God, that limb is so much fatter than that limb, right? When they have these body image disorders, it comes from parietal lobe imbalances. Okay. When we look at the frontal lobe, this is creating motion and movement. It's your thinking initiation, it's your motivation, it's your ambition, your drive. All of that is frontal lobe. So when people like they don't have the energy or they're lazy and they don't want to do much and they just want to be on a couch and not do much and just live in their parents' basement forever and ever and ever, right? These are people that have frontal lobe demise, frontal lobe issues. Um, the frontal lobe is also involved in inhibition. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by inhibition is when you have little children and you say, don't push your sister down the stairs, she can get hurt. Do you understand? And they say, yes, okay. And then 2 days later, they push their sister down the stairs again. It's because they're 3 and 4 years old and the frontal lobe hasn't fully developed, so they can't inhibit their impulses. They just act out. So, a lot of people that have ADD or ADHD, a lot of depression, a lot of your OCDs, these are all issues in different parts of the frontal lobe of the brain. If you think of a baby that's just born, think of how fast their heart rate is going. It's super quick. Think of how quickly they're breathing, super quick, because they can't inhibit their heart rate and their breathing. It can't slow it down. This hasn't fully developed yet. They can't control their bowel movements or urination because they can't inhibit that yet. So they have to wear diapers. The frontal lobe is involved in controlling that. And as people get older, 80s, 90s, hundreds, sometimes they have to go back to the diaper because they lost this part of the brain starts to break down and degrade, so they need the assistance, right? They can't inhibit bowel movements or urination again. So reasoning, judgment, personality, a lot of that comes from the frontal lobe. The temporal lobe over here, temporal lobe is involved with hearing, understanding language, right? Uneven understanding the tone and the sound and the vibration, being able to interpret that information. A lot of memory is stored deep to the temporal lobe. Now, the brain stem, remember that's the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. The medulla is really important because we have cranial nerves 8 through 12 that are there, and the biggie is cranial nerve number 10. 10 is the vagal nerve. It's Roman numeral. So cranial nerve 10 is the vagal nerve, and that controls breathing, blood pressure, your heart rate, your digestive tract. All of that is primarily controlled by cranial nerve 10, which is the vagal nerve. Remember, vagus means vagrant, it wanders to about 80 to 90% of the body. And this medulla, right down here, is protected by a vertebra called C1, which is the atlas. This is why many doctors of chiropractic find it so very important to adjust the C1 vertebrae to stimulate or modulate that vagal nerve, especially people that have irregular heartbeat, arrhythmias, blood pressure issues, breathing issues, babies that have projectile vomiting, they have valve issues in the stomach and they can't hold down the food, swallowing issues, sleeping issues. Very, very important to look at that atlas vertebra, that C1, because it protects the medulla, and these cranial nerves 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 nuclei originate there. This is why when babies are born and they're pulled out of the birth canal and there's traction on the baby's head with excessive rotation, that can subluxate the atlas, creating neurological interference at the level of the medulla. And that's why they'll check the APGAR score of the baby, checking heartbeat, breathing, blood pressure, body temperature. Did they move their bowels? Did they urinate? All these things are also controlled by the medulla. Okay, so hopefully this gives you a little bit of an understanding of the main parts of their brain and some of the important functions. When we look at the brain from this view, I like this color coding because you could see again frontal lobe, occipital lobe. There's your cerebellum, so we know that this is posterior and this is anterior. That's why this is the frontal, and back here is occipital. Here's your parietal lobe. Here's your temporal lobe. Here's the medulla. Here's the pons. And if you move the temporal lobe up a little bit, right in there, that would be the midbrain. So you got medulla, pons, and then midbrain. Now look at these two areas, very important, precentral and postcentral gyrus. So the postcentral gyrus is kind of still purplish, it's part of the parietal lobe, and the precentral gyrus is on that pinkish, reddish side, it's part of the frontal lobe. Right in between, right in here, is a groove called the sulcus, and it's called the central sulcus. So in front of that is the pre-central gyrus, and behind the central sulcus is post, which means after, post-central gyrus. So you have a pre-central gyrus and a post-central gyrus. And if we think back to sensory and motor tracts, or ascending and efferent information, all of your sensory information ends up going to this part of the brain, and all of the motor information begins in the precentral gyrus. So when you want to move your arm and you want to move your leg, yes, the frontal lobe initiates it and sends the signals of what we want to happen, but it's going to relay it to the precentral gyrus, to the control center to your arm, the control center to the leg, the control center of your facial muscles, okay? And as you feel stuff like vibration, hot, cold, and you could say, oh, I just banged my big toe and I can feel my big toe hurting, all that sensory input went up the spinal cord and ended up somewhere in the postcentral gyrus. In which exact spot of the postcentral gyrus? Well, let's take a look in just a second. So here is a real brain when we look at the dissection. And you'll see, once you find the cerebellum, you know that this is posterior. Once you identify that this is posterior, we know the occipital lobe is in the back. We know the frontal lobe is in the front. We know the parietal lobe is here. Here's the central sulcus. I'm going to outline it. It goes all the way down through here. The central sulcus is the only one that goes all the way down right to that temporal lobe. And it's the delineation between the precentral and postcentral gyrus. Okay. Here's your medulla, here's your pons, and then your midbrain would be higher. Cerebellum for balance and coordination, occipital lobe for vision, temporal lobe for hearing, postcentral gyrus is sensory, precentral gyrus is motor, frontal lobe, this is all for initiation of movement, ambition, drive, personality, inhibition, being able to inhibit, all in it, right? We know that ADD starts here. We know many of your OCDs happen in here. Okay, when we come back, I want to talk about the homunculus a little bit. So let's take a break here. We come back, I want to focus on just the homunculus.